Canadian law now puts the onus on business to be sure their supply chains don't use forced labor or child labor. Now KPMG has surveys of thousands of firms' reports to assess how companies are responding. Jillian Frank is a KPMG law partner and national ESG legal services lead for KPMG Canada. Thanks for being with us, Jillian.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with how we're doing. We have seen some cases of companies who've been caught up in this, but overall, are Canadian companies taking this seriously?
Everything we've seen from the reports that we looked at to the clients that we spoke to suggest companies are taking this very seriously. Child labor and forced labor is something that's part of Canadians' commitment to responsible business practice.
And so when we do see people taking it seriously, what does that involve? What are companies doing to make sure? Because with globalization, it means your supply chain could be in a country with very different laws and standards, very different practices. How do you make sure that you're not offside what we would consider the right law?
There are many challenges to this legislation, including getting up the learning curve on what forced labor is, what child labor is, where the risks are, and looking at potentially thousands of suppliers across the world. So I'd say the key theme is continuous improvement. That's the positive part, that we're seeing that companies reported truthfully on what they're doing and have committed to continuous improvement to their systems to address this issue.
I have seen some suggestion that companies could do a better job of the reporting piece of this. Is it unnecessarily complicated for them to actually get their arms around the supply chain and what's actually happening?
It is complicated because the supply chain is complicated. As I said, many organizations will have hundreds, if not thousands, of supply chain partners. And trying to identify where the risks of forced labor and child labor are in those supply chains is a very complex exercise and by its nature difficult to describe in a report.
So how could we do better on that front, given that it is complex? Companies are doing their best, but they are now being held to this new standard. And as I said, some have been kind of identified. Now, where that process goes remains to be seen. But it's not something you want to be in the headlines about. They want to avoid it. So what's the advice to companies to find ways to avoid that?
To learn about where the risks are of forced labor and child labor. Train your teams on what are signs of forced labor and child labor, and start to engage with suppliers to find out what they're doing to address this issue with their raw material suppliers, with their suppliers.
So would we expect to see changes to how people source things over time as we shine lights on these practices?
I would expect so. The commitment that we've seen from the Canadian business community is to address this issue. And as we set out in the analysis that we did of these reports, 90% of companies indicated that they are committed to continuous improvement of their systems, training, and risk assessments on this issue.
Which is a great number. And from your analysis, does it feel as though that's translating into a lot of positive action?
The important part of our analysis is that this is year one, so that's a baseline. We can see what companies have committed to, what they're currently doing, and then compare that to next year's reports. This is an annual reporting requirement, so we will get to see and track the improvement over time, which I think is the important part of this analysis.
It is indeed, and we'll watch with you. Jillian, thanks for being with us for this.
Thank you.
Jillian Frank is KPMG law partner and national ESG legal services lead for KPMG Canada. Time for the takeaway and giving credit where it's due. The federal government recently said it would join the province of Quebec in funding for Telsat. The $2.5 billion will support Telesat's Lightspeed project, which will build and deploy a network of satellites across Canada, especially in the Arctic and rural areas. It allowed the government to frame the investment as one that brings high-speed internet access to more Canadians. The news was met with criticism from the opposition Conservatives, one of whom tweeted asking Elon Musk how much it would cost to buy those same Canadians internet via the Starlink network, Musk's competing low-orbit consumer internet product. Less than half was Musk's answer, but even the Conservatives seemed to know they had a red herring on their hands, and the industry minister was quick to exploit the moment. The investment in Telesat isn't just for an end product, like buying a certain number of widgets for Canadian households. It's an investment in a Canadian technology firm, which was a pioneer in this sector, one that will create good jobs in this country, keeping tax dollars working here rather than sending them to a Silicon Valley billionaire, and also, and this part is downplayed, improve Canada's security and therefore sovereignty in our Arctic North. That last bit may not be the headline on the press release, given that Arctic security is of national strategic importance and therefore not something that's generally discussed in detail. But securing our northern border and aligning with our strategic partners on it is of critical value to all Canadians. Is the Telsat investment an example of government trying to centrally plan? Not really. It's an example of what governments can do more of, namely make procurement decisions with a national interest finger on the scale. It makes good sense to buy Canadian when the Canadian product is as good or better than any other. My takeaway? The nature of politics means it can be a reflex to criticize your opponent, but then on second thought, sometimes they might just be getting it right. That's Taking Stock for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.